the first ever dogfight between the first jet fighters from the Axis and the Allies' world. Towards the end of World War II, the Me-262 and Meteor were both used, but rules about the Meteor kept it from facing the Me-262 before the Victory Day in Europe. In this video, we'll compare the features of these two planes and learn from what pilots experienced to figure out which plane might have been better in a fight. In a post from last year, we learned about the start of a new era in aviation when the first British jet-powered aircraft, the Gloster E-2839, flew on May 15, 1941. But it took almost 2 more years before the first jet aircraft for production soared into the skies. The aircraft was the Meteor, another creation by Gloster. The prototype DG-202G, which you can see at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, first flew on March 5, 1943. It wasn't until July of the next year that regular squadrons got their hands on these straight-wing jets. Initially, they were stationed at Manston before being moved to air bases in Europe. Interestingly, the Meteor was so secretive that it wasn't allowed to fly over German territory. Now, on the other side of the war, the Germans were ahead of the British in jet-powered flight. The Heinkel HE-178, an unusual jet plane, had taken to the skies in August 1939, even before the war began. This gave German designers a head start in developing high-speed aircraft. The first German jet fighter, the Me-262, was already in development by 1939 and completed its first flight a year before the Gloster fighter. It entered service a few months earlier, too. When you compare the two aircraft, which you can easily do at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, you notice some clear differences. Germany was really focused on achieving high-speed flight right from the start. The Me-262 had a swept-wing design that was way ahead of its time, especially when you compare it to the Meteor, Vampire, and P-59-era Comet that the Allies were working on. This wing design was actually a result of the original BMW engines planned for the fighter. The wing sweep was necessary to keep the aircraft's balance right. The Me-262 was initially supposed to use BMW 003 engines, but these engines had a lot of problems, including a scary incident where both engines failed during a test flight. Eventually, they went with the Jumo 004 engine, which looked very different from British engine designs. British engines were shorter and bulkier, while the Jumo engine had a sleeker shape. However, the Jumo engine had a reputation for not being very reliable. In the best-case scenario, it could only last about 50 hours, and in reality, pilots were lucky to get 20 hours before needing a full engine rebuild. One big issue with the German engines was that the materials they used couldn't handle the extreme heat produced by the engine. On the other hand, Whittle's engine designs handled the heat better, and they could last for more than 100 hours before needing maintenance. The Me-262A1A, which was considered the definitive version of the fighter, could reach an amazing top speed of 559 miles per hour and climbed over 37,000 feet. This was a remarkable achievement in the middle of World War II. In comparison, the early production Meteors could only reach about 450 miles per hour, although they could climb above 40,000 feet. The Messerschmitt Me-262 saw more action during World War II than the Meteor, and its incredibly high speed initially posed a problem for German pilots. They were so fast that using traditional air combat tactics didn't work well, especially when trying to attack bombers. The closing speed, the speed at which they closed in on enemy planes, was just too high to consistently hit targets. So they came up with a new technique called slashing. In this method, the jets would dive diagonally across a group of bombers. This gave them the best chance to hit enemy aircraft. Once they got the hang of this slashing technique, the Me-262s became a real threat to the Allied war effort. The faster piston engine planes at the time, like the Hawker Tempest, were still slower than the German jets. However, they figured out that they could easily attack the Me-262s during their landing phase. They would often wait for the 262s to return from their missions and then pick them off as they were coming into land. One challenge with these early jets was that they didn't respond well to quick changes in throttle engine power. For the Jumo engine, adjusting the throttle too quickly could lead to engine failure or even a fire. So once the jets were on their landing approach, they were vulnerable and didn't have many options to defend themselves. The Meteor had a quieter and more secret role during World War II. It stayed in the UK to counter the V-1 threat, and it was quite successful in this task. But when it was eventually sent to the continent, it wasn't allowed to fly over German territory, so its combat opportunities were limited. The Meteor didn't have a big speed advantage over the piston engine planes of that time, and the early versions didn't handle very well either. Based on what we know about their technical specs and real-world performance, it seems that the Me-262 would have had the upper hand most of the time. It could have simply flown away from the fight, being 100 miles per hour faster than the British fighter. The Meteor could have outclimbed the 262, reaching higher altitudes. This could have been an advantage in high-altitude combat. Although people often talk about the speed difference between the early Meteor and the 262, it's worth noting that a modified F3 version of the Meteor broke the world speed record in 1946, reaching a speed of 606 miles per hour. This shows that the Meteor had the potential to further develop, if needed, during wartime conditions. If the 262 and the Meteor had met in combat in 1945, it would have been a fascinating battle. The type of combat required hadn't been tested at the time, and it would have put different pressures on the aircraft and the pilots. The unpredictable nature of the Jumo engines could have been a disadvantage for the Messerschmitt compared to the Meteor. Also, with Allied fighters patrolling their home bases, the 262 would likely have suffered significant losses. In the end, the different development paths of these aircraft can be summarized in the context of what was needed. Germany was in a desperate situation, losing ground, and needed a fast and powerful plane quickly. So the 262 was developed rapidly, leading to engine design issues. The Meteor, on the other hand, wasn't seen as such an urgent priority once it proved effective against the V-1 threat. By the time it was ready for active service, the Allies already had a strong position. If the situation were reversed, we would probably have seen the Meteor develop much faster. It's an interesting thought and a plausible what-if scenario.